Well, thanks so much for having me. I've never been to Poland before, and I've been enjoying myself very much. I look forward to talking to you about this topic. I should mention, just to make sure I don't forget, that I did get a lot of help from my friends on all of this. The Templeton Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation have provided funding. Kent Keel did all the work on psychopaths that I'll talk about. And Daryl Cameron is the main scientist who did the work on implicit moral attitudes. So I'm just the one that gets to come to Poland and talk, which is great. I want to start by asking you a question. Which one of these people would you invite to dinner? If you saw them on the street and they seemed friendly enough, you said, well, they're hungry, they'd like to go eat. How many people would invite this guy back? How many people would invite this guy back? Yeah. The first one? You invite the first one? Yeah, most people invite the first one. Well, that's Pedro Lopez. He's the monster of the Andes who raped and killed over 300 women. And so he would be a wonderful dinner partner. He could tell you about his exploits. But you might not get away alive, and so I don't think you would invite him. This guy doesn't look quite so nice, but this is Zel Kavinsky, who was a professor. He got 2 PhDs, was voted the best teacher at the University of Pennsylvania, developed a new medication, made millions of dollars, gave it all away to charity, gave one of his kidneys to a stranger. He's just like a saint, right? But you can't tell just by looking at them, right? That's part of the lesson, that you have to go beyond the surface, not the way someone looks, in order to determine whether they're a psychopath or not. You also have to go beyond what they say. So here's an example of a dialogue from Kent Keel, the scientist at the University of New Mexico that I work with. And basically, he had a girlfriend, and one day she got mad at him and called him fat, bald, and broke. It's important to recognize that it was true. He was fat, bald, and broke. But nonetheless, he got very mad at her, waited till she was drawing a bath, beat her head against the wall, held her under the water until she was dead, rolled her up in a blanket, and then threw her off a bridge. Then he was caught and returned to prison, where Kent asked him, he said, her body was recovered under the bridge several days later by some railroad workers. So Kent said, well, was what you did wrong? Well, what do you think he said? He said, of course it was wrong. I never should have thrown her off the bridge because they found the body. That was the wrong thing to do. Right? So he's thinking about it in a different way than we would. So Kent says, okay, but was it really bad actually to kill her? And he said, oh yeah, of course it was. Of course it was bad to kill her. But notice that what's happened now is when you probe, when you ask a question explicitly of someone like this, like Pedro Lopez or another psychopath, then they'll give you the answer that they think you want to get. So the problem with dealing with people like this in the legal system and in daily life is, how do you figure out what they're really thinking? You can't go by the way they look. You can't go by the way they talk, because they'll constantly be trying to hide from you what they're up to. And I think this is a serious problem. Some people might commit a bad act and then really feel remorse, really recognize that what they did was wrong. But other people will just say, whatever, it doesn't matter, it wasn't really wrong, they won't recognize it. So there are a lot of different things that they might, attitudes they might hold. The question is, do they really know, do some of these criminals that are psychopaths really know that what they're doing is wrong? They might just be lying. They know they don't believe it's wrong. They tell you they believe it's wrong because they want to fool you. They might say, yes, it's wrong, out of habit because they've talked to their lawyer many times, and the lawyer tells them, oh yes, say that your acts were wrong, because if you express remorse, you'll make it through the legal system better, right? They might just not really reflect on what they're doing and don't think about it. They just go from moment to moment without planning, without thinking about their lives or whether what they're doing is right or wrong, whether they're acting in the way that they should be acting. They just don't think about it. They might not understand. My favorite example is E equals mc squared, the famous formula from Einstein. Energy equals mass times the speed of light squared. Can anyone here explain to me why the speed of light is squared? I can't, but I know it's true. I just don't really understand what it means. And maybe that's their attitude towards moral judgments. They know they're supposed to say it. They might even believe it's true, but they don't really understand it. That's what I'm going to suggest is the real position of psychopaths. But in any case, the trick is going to be, how can we tell from their explicit statements and their body language and the way they act, how can we tell what they really think? That's a real challenge. And it matters to the legal system, because the legal system is going to determine whether to punish them or not by figuring out whether they appreciate the wrongfulness of what they're doing, at least in the United States. In the United States, the Model Penal Code, which at least until the 80s and for many states even since the 80s has been a model for the insanity defense, says a person's not responsible for criminal conduct if at the time of such conduct, as a result of mental disease or defect, he lacks substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness or criminality of his conduct. So if the criminal does not really understand that what they're doing is wrong, doesn't appreciate it, then they're found not guilty by reason of insanity, and they're not sent to prison. They're sent somewhere else. They're not put back on the streets, but they're not sent to prison, and they're not found guilty. This, by the way, this clause of not appreciating the wrongfulness has been part of Anglo-American law since at least the 1500s, when they talked about an insane person as not being able to tell right from wrong. Similarly, in Scotland, as recently as 2010, a person's not criminally responsible for conduct if they do not appreciate the nature or wrongfulness of the conduct. So again, this notion of appreciating the wrongfulness more recently in a different country. I asked Bartosz to give me, this detail on the Polish law. All I could get was a person's not criminally responsible if he can't recognize the meaning of his act. Does anyone here know more about the Polish insanity defense? I'm trying to find out more. So if anyone does know more, please tell me later, because I don't know what that means. Recognize the meaning of the act. But I take it that recognition is not simply being able to answer a question, was it wrong, but to somehow appreciate the meaning, what does it really mean to rape and kill someone, right? What's the meaning of that? It's going to require more than just going, oh, it's bad. You have to feel it in some way. That's where emotion comes into it, that many people would say you have to have some type of emotional reaction, or you don't really recognize it. You're only saying words like E equals mc squared that I don't really understand. So we need some help. We have to be able to, we want to be able to develop a tool that could be useful in everyday life, in the prisons, in the court system, that will help us understand what it means to appreciate or to recognize the meaning of an act, where we can apply this test to defendants who are psychopaths, like Pedro Lopez. He has raped and killed 298 women, and now he is up for conviction for his 299th. And you want to know whether he appreciates the wrongfulness. He keeps doing it. And if not, he'll get the insanity defense. If he does, he'll be found guilty. So it'll make a big difference. Okay? Now, the tool that I want to suggest is available to us now if we turn to science is the many studies of implicit moral attitudes. These are well known in America. I don't know, I assume they're well known in Poland as well, these tests of implicit moral attitudes, particularly with regard to racism and sexism. People will say, I have nothing against blacks, or I don't think women should stay at home. But then when you do these tests, you find that people still associate black with bad and white with good, or they associate women with cooking and men with business. They still have those associations implicitly, but if you ask them, they will honestly tell you, I don't believe any of that. But what we want to do then is to study those implicit attitudes that they are not even aware of themselves. Okay? Philosophers, of course, at least in the US, there's a big issue of many philosophers have this. That's all that was for. The cause seems to be some type of implicit stereotype or association or belief, and they might be very different. Now, psychologists have used a number of different, the implicit association test with Mahzarin Banaji has been extremely popular. You can go on her website, implicit.com, I think it is. The affect misattribution procedure was developed by Keith Payne. I have a picture of him later. The process dissociation procedure is what we'll talk about in great detail. The Stroop test with Tobias Egner. Eye tracking we've been doing with Nina Struminger, and brain scanning in various paradigms we're doing with Felipe de Brigard. So in our lab, we're actually studying all of these and trying to determine what's the best one. But I obviously don't have time to talk about all of them, so I'll focus on the process dissociation procedure. And the reason for focusing on that one is that all the others use one task to study implicit attitudes, and then they separately ask you what you really believe. And that, as a plan for science, is no good because things might happen in between the two tasks. What you really want is a way to study the implicit attitude and the explicit belief at the same time, right? You don't want to ask the psychopath, is it wrong, and then take them into another room and test their implicit attitude and whether they really appreciate the wrongfulness. Instead, you want to do it all at once, and that's what you can do in the process dissociation procedure. This is sometimes called multinomial modeling, by the way, for people who know something about this. What we do, simple to explain. We have a sequential priming task. We have two sets of words, murder, rape. One is words that are names of act types that are wrong. Murder, rape, theft, assault, abuse, betrayal. Does everyone agree that those are wrong? That's good, okay? And then writing, baking, painting, tennis, and golf. Does everyone agree those are not wrong? What? Depends what? Oh, well, baking, yeah, if you bake your neighbor, and some people might have questions about golf because of the environmental impact, but we got these pre-tested, and people were not thinking about baking their neighbor. Okay. And we give them a fixation cross, then we give them a prime word, prime and target words chosen from these lists. Give them a prime word for 100 milliseconds, and then a little break, and a target word for 400 to 800 milliseconds. And we tell them, the instructions are, ignore the prime word, just tell us whether the target word is wrong or not. And notice it's going very quickly, less than a second for each trial, very, very quickly. So people are making mistakes 20 to 30% of the time, just because it's so quick, you can't keep up, okay? But let's suppose you say that baking is the target word. Well, if tennis is the prime word and baking is the target word, you still might get it wrong 20% of the time. But if murder is the prime word and baking is the target word, people will say that baking is wrong more like 40 or 50% of the time. And it's that difference between the error rates when the prime is neutral and the error rates when the prime is wrong that tells you what their attitude is towards murder. Because it's going so fast, you're getting their non-conscious responses to the word. Okay? Then what we look at is the congruent and the incongruent trials. In the incongruent trials, you've got a wrong prime and a neutral target, or a neutral prime and a wrong target. And by looking at these patterns, I won't go through these equations. I'll put the equations up here just because Nino told me to. No, it's your fault. But you can actually then look at the error rates in the congruent and incongruent trials of different sorts and calculate through these equations. I can give them to you later if you're interested. And calculate the C factor, which is the control over your judgment. Presuming that subjects in the experiment want to follow the instructions, then they want to classify the target word and ignore the prime word. And if they're able to control themselves, they'll get that right. So when the target word is neutral, they'll say neutral, and when the target word is wrong, they'll say wrong. And they'll lack control to the extent that when the target word is neutral, they say it's wrong, and when the target word is wrong, they say it's neutral. So you can just look at the error rates and figure out the control factor. And the bias is how much does the prime word affect your answer on the target word. Okay, so you can calculate these two factors. Notice it's very important. Think back to racial implicit attitudes. If you have a racial implicit attitude, that might or might not affect your behavior. Some people might have very strong implicit attitudes and yet be able to control themselves. Other people might have very weak implicit attitudes, but they still can't control themselves. So you need to know both of these in order to predict behavior, which is what we eventually want to do. Notice that none of this, how many people are familiar with the kind of system 1 and system 2 in psychology and the fast and slow thinking? I just want to say for those who follow that literature from Kahneman et al., we're not doing all of that, right? There's nothing here about whether it's conscious or unconscious. Doesn't matter whether the prime is subliminal or supraliminal. Doesn't matter. Don't really know whether it's emotion or reasoning. I'll talk about that later. There's no particular content tied to it. And it's not that one operates fast and the other operates slow. Maybe they do, but we're not assuming that yet. That's no part of the test. You have to determine whether that's true. So in order to determine whether that's true, we did a bunch of experiments. We took 65 subjects and then followed it up with 144. We gave them all 4 conditions, right, where the first letter is the prime and the second letter is the target. And remember, they're told to ignore the prime and only report on whether the target is wrong. Okay? And the hypotheses are that the control factor will be affected by the response deadline, because if you've got more time, you'll be able to give the accurate answer more often, right? Under more, with less time pressure, but will not be affected by whether it's a wrong or neutral prime, because your control should remain the same. Whereas your automatic will be affected by the prime type, but not by the response deadline. And sure enough, that's what we got. If you notice, with the 400 millisecond deadline, we're getting control factor of about 0.35, 0.37, whereas with the 800, we're getting 7.577. So you give people more time, they've got more control over what they're doing. In contrast, if you look at the wrong prime versus the neutral prime, automatic factors do not change when you change the deadline going across the columns, but they do change when you change the prime. So control is not affected by what kind of prime it is. They're pretty much the same, but the automatic factor is affected by what kind of prime it is, 0.66 being significantly different from 0.5. So this just shows the test works. It separates out these two factors in the way that we would have expected. Okay? But then the question is, well, maybe this moral priming is really just emotions. You say murder, you say theft, and people feel a certain affect. It's an emotion. Maybe, but maybe there's more to it than that. So we checked it with a separate set of words that are negative in emotion: rabies, cancer, disaster, trauma, distress, pain, accident. None of those are morally loaded words, but they're still bad, and so people are feeling negative emotions. And we found that on the automatic factor, the negative prime had some effect, but the moral judgment was actually over and above the mere emotion. It was separate from the emotion itself, so that moral judgment has to be independent of mere negative emotion. Okay? That's what that study shows. But we also, in that experiment, wanted to start looking at whether we could apply this to psychopaths. And so we used the Levinson Self-Report Psychopathy Scale. I can go into all these scales in detail if anybody has questions, but I'll leave it out for now. But we found that psychopathy scores were associated with a reduced implicit moral attitude. So people like Pedro Lopez, who rapes and kills 300 people, don't have this implicit attitude against what they're doing. Not surprisingly, but it hadn't been shown before. Now, this is not real psychopaths. We did not study Pedro Lopez himself, right? This is with students and people from the local community who varied in their psychopathy scores. We're planning to take this into the prison to test real psychopaths next year. But it's important that the psychopathy scores were not associated with control or with the negative emotion trials. They were only deviant on the implicit moral attitudes, on the judgments of wrongness themselves. Okay? Then we wanted to find out what's the basis for this. Like what in the brain is giving people these moral attitudes. So we did a separate set of experiments. Again, I don't know that all of these technical details are necessary here, but there was an error-related negativity at CZ, which is kind of a front central electrode and is associated with the anterior cingulate part of the brain. And so that's been shown in previous studies in the race tasks, so we wanted to see if it would work in our moral judgment task. And sure enough, what you get is what this is, in brief, is when someone says to, like, murder baking, and they go, baking is wrong, most people go, oh no, that's not right. And they recognize they made an error. And then this brain signal is associated with the recognition that you just made a mistake. And the people low in psychopathy and medium in psychopathy show that consistently at different electrode sites, and the people higher in psychopathy don't show it. So now notice you can do this task with electrodes, and you can test how their brain is reacting. You don't have to ask them, do you think it's wrong? So the hope is that you can get beyond their self-reports, and they won't be able to fool you and manipulate you anymore when you want to decide what to do with them, okay? But just to show that it really affects behavior and not just reports, we wanted to bring it out into the field. We did a number of different things. We gave them a task of charitable giving. There's some chairs up here. Feel free to come up if you want. We wanted to predict behavior, and we predicted charitable giving on controversial charities. Like, it's hard to believe, but there's actually a charity in America which is pro-eating meat. They're trying to get people to eat more meat. It's called Hunters Against PETA. And then you could also give money to PETA, or you could give it to Hunters Against PETA. And you could predict which one they were going to give by their brain activity. But I think it's more interesting, we looked at controversial things like gay marriage. There was a referendum, and we tested people as they were coming out of the voting booths. And we tested a bunch of people. Doesn't matter. The point is, we could use our tests of implicit attitudes to predict how they were going to vote in the election. Okay? And that means that it's not just an implicit attitude in their head, it actually affects their behavior. Here are their results. Again, the technical details don't matter. What matters for this crowd is the legal uses. So how are we going to take these tests that seem to, number one, show that the moral appreciation is independent of emotion, and number two, actually predict real behavior in the field and use them in the legal system? Well, we're not going to do any of this yet. The first thing is don't get scared. We're not there yet. It has to be reconfirmed with real psychopaths and lots of different samples from different groups. But if it all works out, then eventually, 10, 20 years from now, we should be able to use it for predicting their future behavior, which would then be useful in sentencing them and in determining who should be released on parole. For treatment, there are treatment programs for psychopaths. Michael Caldwell's program in Wisconsin has been successful in treating them and getting them to commit fewer violent crimes. But he doesn't know when the treatment has worked yet. So you say, well, let's treat them for a year. But of course, some people only need 9 months and other people need 2 years. And this could be used to determine when the treatment has worked. Responsibility. We want to know not just whether they can answer the question, but whether they appreciate the wrongfulness of their answer. And one way to understand appreciation is, do they have this implicit attitude in addition to what they say explicitly? To study effects of exposure. Exposure in prison, for example, everyone knows that the longer you're in prison, the higher your recidivism rate. And it might be because it deadens your implicit attitudes. High crime neighborhoods, domestic violence, young children that have seen their parents engaged in violence against each other, or usually one of them against the other, can then become desensitized and don't have the implicit attitude against it. And we want to know when that's happening so that we can do something about it. And finally, there we go, bias in judges and jurors and prosecutors. To be able to take jurors and say, I take it's going to be mainly judges here, but the same problem arises in judges as in jurors. How do you tell whether they really are biased against some group that the defendant happens to be a member of? We can test those. So I've been talking for 30 minutes. I'll just say quickly some of the philosophical things, and then you can tell me which of these you want to talk about in more detail. Moral responsibility, we've already talked about. For the philosophers in the crowd, you can use these implicit moral attitudes to better understand debates between expressivists and realists about moral judgments, we think, because you want to know what they're actually expressing when they say a moral judgment. Moral internalism, we suspect that the explicit beliefs or statements of people about morality do not entail motivation, but the implicit attitudes are more closely connected to motivation, which would explain why we can use this test to predict behavior. And in moral epistemology. If, for example, the implicit moral attitudes are mere associations, as are studied in the implicit attitude test, you just associate black with bad and white with good, but you don't believe that black is bad and white is good. It's just an association. Then it might not call for justification as much as when you really believe it. Just like if somebody says the moon is larger when it's looks larger when it's next to the horizon, you don't expect someone to justify that. It just looks that way. No justification seems to be needed. But if someone says, I believe it's larger, now you want to know what justifies them in believing it. And so it might be that we can actually use these kinds of attitudes to stop the skeptical regress. All of those are, of course, very controversial claims. I raise them now just to see whether you have any questions about any of them. And we've got, about 15 minutes now for questions? Is that about right? Okay. I tried to fit it all in under the headlines. So Are there any questions?